Good evening. Welcome. Doug Ritchie Head of School, thank you so much for being here this evening. I would like to begin tonight by asking our administrators in attendance to just take a quick stand up and let me thank you, administrators that are here in attendance tonight. Yeah, I want to give them a round of applause because they helped put all this together. Before I have Linda Pryor come forward to introduce our speaker for this evening, I wanted to just give you a quick overview of how we have started this in the past years. Tomorrow, so tonight, is the eve of what we call our 5-star seminar for students, and we have 10 alumni and other speakers coming in a seminar type format, and we always ask one of our keynote speakers to have a presentation the night before, so we're very honored tonight to have Dr. Angel Parham from the University of Virginia here to speak. And this is Dr. Parham's second visit to Brookfield Academy. She was here a couple of years ago for a classical literature topic that Linda had in the Mission and Academic Office. So we're excited, and Dr. Bulio, myself, and Shelley Sullivan, our head of the middle school, were at an independent school character conference, and Dr. Parham was speaking there, and after she was finished, because I love listening to her talks, I said, you know, would you be interested in coming back and speaking at Brookfield Academy? And she said, yes, absolutely. So we are honored to have her tonight, and I'm going to have Linda give you the complete bio. But other than that, thanks for taking the time to join us. Enjoy, and hopefully we'll get together after we're finished. So enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Welcome. It's great to see all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. You know, as Doug mentioned, we just loved having Angel here a few years ago. We're thrilled that she's back. I did leave a couple of these laying around on the different tables in case any of you want to see the whole schedule for tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is our 5-star seminar. There will be 9 alums and a few other speakers, but Angel will be our keynote. So it's going to be a great morning for our upper school students. But let me introduce Angel now. Dr. Angel Adams Parham is a sociologist whose research explores the history of race in America with a particular focus on how racial identities and categories have shifted over time. She has an award-winning book, American Routes, Racial Palimpsests and the Transformation of Race, which traces these changes through the history of New Orleans. And she's currently working on another book which looks at 3 significant New Orleans sites over 300 years. That seems like a lot of research to me, right? And asks how communities can honestly engage with difficult racial histories in ways that bring people together rather than drive them apart. Beyond her academic research, Dr. Parham has a real passion for young people and for education. And she works hard to bring her ideas to life in schools and communities. She trains K-12 educators on how to bring more Black writers and Black history into their teaching. And to that end, she co-authored The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom in Classical Literature, which is this book. And we do have it in the back there for sale, and she's more than happy to sign it if anyone would like to purchase it after our talk. She also founded Beyond the Classical Community, a nonprofit that develops classical curricula designed to connect students from all backgrounds. Her next public-facing book is called Conversations on American Freedom, which brings Black writers of the 18th and 19th centuries into dialogue with our founders and founding documents to explore what freedom has meant and still means in America. Angel was an active voice in the classical education movement and was a featured participant at this year's National Symposium for Classical Education. I was lucky enough to see her on a panel there, and it was also in Phoenix, so that was lucky too. She also contributes to the Kern Foundation's work on character education, which reflects her conviction that schools should be forming the whole person. It's Brookfield Academy's conviction too, not just preparing them academically, but helping them grow in wisdom and virtue. Angel's writing has appeared in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, in Public Discourse, and Common Good magazine. She's been a member of the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and received a Fulbright grant. She holds her bachelor's degree from Yale and her doctorate from here in Wisconsin at UW-Madison. Please join me in welcoming Angel Adams Parham.
Thank you, Linda, for that very generous introduction, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you all, and I just thank you so much for coming out when there were so many other things that you could be doing, and it's just a pleasure to be here for this second time at this esteemed school. So I want to, you got a bio, but I just want to give you a little more of a personal introduction as well, to kind of explain where I'm coming from and why all of this is so very, very important to me. So education is really at the core of what drives me and what I love. It's education of my own daughters, so I homeschooled for quite a long time, and before putting my daughters into a classical Christian school in Charlottesville when we moved there 5 years ago. And I think it's because my own life has been so greatly transformed by the educational opportunities that I've had, and because I've been afforded so many benefits that I just know are God's grace, and that I'm just really wanting other young people to have. And so what I am doing is it's a part of what I see as a larger project, and I think in terms of the K-16 educational spectrum. I don't see a rigid separation between them, because if we care about the kind of young people that we're sending into the world, we really do have to think K-16 at least, right? What they are getting here at Brookfield is absolutely crucial for the kinds of citizens that we're going to end up having. It's crucial for who ends up in my college classrooms, which I can tell you I care quite a lot about. And I will share just a little bit from that classroom and some of the remarks that I make here that I think will make it even more clear why what you're doing here at Brookfield Academy is so very, very important. So I'm going to be talking about freedom and flourishing across 250 years of the American Project. A very exciting year, especially for us at the University of Virginia. As you can imagine, the 250th is a very, very big deal at Thomas Jefferson University. So I will be sharing from this idea of the 250th and the idea of freedom. So we'll start here with some familiar words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I want to stop there and ask you to just think about what is freedom and what is happiness? What is freedom and what is happiness? So the title that I started out with said freedom and flourishing, right? And so you might wonder, so did you just change the topic on us? So, we went from flourishing to happiness. So the reason for that is that I think the older term is happiness, which you see in the Declaration. Today, scholars often think of that as flourishing, just because happiness has gotten a very different connotation, and all kinds of things fall under happiness that really aren't quite what was meant when happiness was talked about. And that's some of what I want to dig into now. So if you think about freedom and think about happiness, get your own definitions in your mind, right? And then what I'm going to show you is from a course that I've taught at UVA. In fact, I'm in the middle of teaching it right now. And it's called Freedom and Flourishing in Political and Social Thought. So we've got a major at UVA called Political and Social Thought. And so this is a year-long seminar where we're just looking at this question of what is freedom and what is flourishing or happiness, starting with the ancients, starting with Plato and Aristotle, and moving into the 21st century, just asking those two questions. And there's a related course that I've taught to first-year students called 7th grade questions. And two of those questions are what is happiness and what is freedom. And so what I'm going to show you next are some of the ways that my students answer these questions when they first come into the class. Right? So before we've read anything, before we talk about anything, I ask them, what do you think freedom is and what do you think flourishing is? So here's one example. Freedom is at its most fundamental the ability to do what one wants at any given time without limit. Any person, outcome, ideal, or anything else that inhibits a person's ability to do what they want in any fashion is a limit on their freedom. Okay? So, number one. Next, ability to do whatever with no restrictions. We see a theme here. Freedom is the ability to make choices without one's life being controlled by something else. It is the ability to pursue one's own interests. I should say these are all first-year students, too. So the 7th grade questions is a first-year seminar. All right, now let's move on to happiness. What is happiness? A lighthearted feeling that makes worries disappear, even if it's for a split second. I love that question mark at the end. So that's a thought. Happiness is feeling like you can fly. It's the feeling of freedom. It's the feeling of waking up in the morning and not feeling your stomach churn, which always makes me wonder what exactly is going on in this situation. The joy one feels is the culmination of free will, achievement, and opportunity. So what you get here is, kind of a combination, I think, of live your own truth, follow your heart, you only live once. Right? And so I get some kind of combination of those responses when I ask my students, what is freedom and what is happiness or flourishing? These are the baseline definitions when they come into the class. And so what I want to kind of explore is what is at stake when young people have what might be considered a malformed idea of what freedom and happiness are. So what you see there to the right is William Blake's drawing from Dante's Inferno. So this is when Dante is in the dark wood and the three beasts come to get him. So freedom, according to this kind of malformed idea, is kind of very much the power to define oneself, often in a kind of vacuum, where you just pick all apart how you want to form yourself. Releasing myself from the strictures of tradition, authority, and convention that stifle my vision of self. The ability to do what I want to do. And flourishing or happiness, crafting and living out my individual idea of what it means to be happy, and this is an individual idea, and living out the above definition of freedom. So what I want to think about is what was maybe a more traditional understanding of freedom and flourishing in the 18th century when the founders were engaged in this project. And so there's a very different understanding of freedom based in large part on the ancient tradition. So freedom was more political self-determination, often opposed to slavery, and it was very fundamentally about self-governance. And so the idea that if you're going to be free, you're going to have to be able to act in such a way that you're not controlled by your appetites, by an impulse, but that you can really govern yourself and think well and wisely. And flourishing, or happiness. So Locke, who's pictured here just below Jefferson, in Second Treatise on Government, he talks about property. And Jefferson placed that, so the language is almost exactly the same from Locke's Second Treatise of Government that Jefferson used in the Declaration, but he chose happiness. And I always think it would be interesting to think that the focus is on pursuing life, liberty, and property. This gives you a very different, kind of thought. But happiness has this very beautiful, capacious vision in history. And then also, especially if you're looking at Aristotle's work, it's really, you can't have this happiness without having the life of virtue. And so all of these were understood. This had been a conversation in the making for millennia. So that idea of liberty and happiness were not just picked out of a hat. They came on a very large tradition, but through a tradition that many Americans are so disconnected from today, which is the reason that I think that we need more of this kind of education, so that young people are part of these conversations before they ever get to be at the University of Virginia. All right, so to bring in a little bit of a taste of what was going on here. So Jefferson, in this 1816 letter, says, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Every government has propensities to command at will the liberty and property of their constituents. There is no safe deposit for these but with the people themselves, nor can they be safe with them without information. Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe." And so this emphasis on education in order to be free, on the freedom of the mind in order to be free. And then later in Notes on the State of Virginia, I won't read the whole thing, he starts out by talking about the importance of learning from history, which is part of what we want to be doing during the 250th, is looking back and learning about what were some of the foundations of this whole idea of the American project. Then he says, "In every government on earth is some trace of human weakness, some germ of corruption and degeneracy, which cunning will discover and wickedness insensibly open, cultivate, and improve. Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depositories." And so it's that question of, now that we're at the 250th, and we are having so many difficult conversations and many people are questioning what does it really mean to be American, we, I think, are in a desperate need to go back, to read, to think, to revisit, to more deeply understand the complexities, the contradictions sometimes, but also the beauty of that whole vision of what the American project is. And then, in line with my book on the Black intellectual tradition, I find it incredibly fruitful to bring in another tradition that is part of the American tradition, which is the Black intellectual tradition, which looks at and takes on this whole American project in such beautiful ways. And part of the reason I also think that this is so important is some of what I'm hearing now, what I hear from some of the young people that I teach, who feel cynical about the idea of what it means to be American, who feel like, not sure if this is something that I want to be associated with. I think it's very important to go back and look at what were African American writers at the beginning doing? What were those actors doing? How were they relating to the American project? And so I think it's incredibly important to also look at this stream of the tradition. And so from the perspective of writers like Phyllis Wheatley and Frederick Douglass, freedom and literally shattering the chains of slavery, not only metaphorical slavery, but actual slavery. And also, in addition to self-governance, self-ownership. So literally owning oneself as property and being able to then govern oneself. And flourishing self-fashioning and living more fully in accordance with virtue. It's very hard to live virtuously when you have no control over your own body, right? And so the opportunity to be able to live and conduct oneself virtuously. I always like to share this story from Frederick Douglass's narrative, and so just to give you a little bit of a setup. He was in the countryside in Maryland, and when he was a young boy, maybe about 11 or 12 years old, he was shifted to a couple in Baltimore. And so he got the opportunity under the new woman who was going to be his mistress to learn how to read. She started learning with him and showing him how to do his ABCs, and then the husband got wind of it and said, "What are you doing? You cannot teach this boy to read. This is the most horrible thing you could ever do. If you teach him to read, he will be unfit to be a slave. Unfit to be a slave. And so she did a complete 180, snatched away all the books, but Douglas had learned his lesson. He had learned that intimate connection between education and freedom. So he writes, "These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was that ability to read that opened everything up. And later in the narrative, he will have an actual physical struggle with another man named Mr. Covey. And so it's this amazing kind of dual freedom that he gets. Early when he's a young boy, learning how to read, and then later when he has this physical struggle with Mr. Covey, and then ultimately gets his physical freedom as well as his mental freedom. Phyllis Wheatley. So Phyllis Wheatley was literally there from the beginning, living in Boston, just down the street from the Boston Massacre. And this is the kind of thing, when I think about the passion that I have for education and what I love to do education. K-16, I think about my many years as a young girl in history class being bored out of my mind every class. It seemed like it was always a stodgy textbook that was super boring, and I just didn't understand why we were doing it again, because it kept repeating, and it didn't seem very interesting. And now all I do is history. And I feel like I wish I had gotten stories like this. This young, extraordinary woman, she is born in West Africa. She is put in the bottom of a slave ship, brought to Boston. She's bought by the Wheaton family, which is a very prominent family in Boston at the time. They discovered that she was extraordinarily smart, and they helped her. So they taught her how to read, they taught her how to write, they invested in her, and she published a volume of poetry when she was quite young, right? But, as I'm saying, she is literally down the street from the Boston Massacre. She's writing poetry at the time. The other thing I always like to emphasize is that Africans at this time did not have to believe in the revolution, right? They had every reason to say, if those folks are for it, I am against it, because these are the people who put me in chains. But that idea of freedom is something that Phyllis Wheatley stood behind, wrote about, supported, and was one of the pins of the revolution. And this kind of story, and what you'll see about her involvement is, I think, what is so exciting that a time like this has to be remembered. So she attempts to publish her volume first in 1772 by getting it published in Boston, and she's not able to get it published there, and so ultimately she ends up getting it published in England in 1773. But before that, the Earl of Dartmouth had appointed a new secretary for the colonies, and he came to visit in Boston. He said, I hear there's this little African girl who writes this extraordinary poetry. I'm not sure I really believe it. I want to see it for myself. And so he shows up at the Wheatley home and basically demands a poem, just kind of on demand right there. Let me see that you can really do this. And so she says, okay. And she writes a poem dedicated to the Earl of Dartmouth, his boss, basically. And so it's to the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth. And what I want you to pay attention to here, I won't read every part of it, but I want you to pay attention to some of what I've underlined and to the themes of freedom that she is weaving throughout this poem. Okay, so the Earl of Dartmouth has just been appointed to be secretary for the colonies, right? So he technically, is the one who's going to be in charge. This is how she starts out with them. And then at the end, she talks about the silken reins. While in thine hand with pleasure we behold the silken reins and freedom's charms unfold. Interesting, silken reins. So he has control, but she is saying, of course you're going to use this control lightly. You're not going to come and bully us, basically, right? So there's a kind of politics in what she's doing here. And then she says, some might wonder why I care so much about freedom. And she says, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. So she's harkening back to when she was stolen from Africa, right? So she's giving some of her own story here, and at the same time reinforcing the love of freedom, and then really imploring Dartmouth to exercise his authority with lightness and wisdom. The politics in her poetry are very clear, and in fact, I think this might be part of the reason that some of the poems that she was originally going to publish when it was going to be published in Boston did not get in when she got her backers in England. And there were some of the poems that were more forthrightly for the Revolution. So when you get a chance to read, I recommend, if you have an interest in this, getting a volume that's got both her poems and her letters. And the letters give you all of this insight into how she was really thinking things through, both in Boston and in England. Now this one is one that, whenever I talk about it, very few people know that this exists. And this is just outstanding. She had an actual exchange with George Washington. So she so admired the Revolution, she took it upon herself to write a poem and a letter to George Washington. And so this is part of the poem, and what she's doing here is she's praising his prowess as a general. So I'll read this last one. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. So Columbia was the name for the Americas. So she's talking about she wants the Americans to win. Anon Britannia proves the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide, a crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold and fading, Washington, be thine. Right, so she's using all of this beautiful kind of allegorical language, praising George Washington, she sends it off to him, and lo and behold, he writes her back. So he writes her back, he says, I'm so flattered, that you thought to write this of me, and says, I find you very talented. If you are ever in the environments where I am, please come by and grace me with your presence. This is the kind of thing, this kind of writing, the kind of interweaving of Black intellectual tradition with the founding that I think is incredibly important to this generation of young people who are asking questions, who are immersed in a time where politically there's a lot of cynicism, resignation. I think it's very important to recover some of these stories. So, when we move forward, where are we today in the struggle toward freedom and flourishing? So, I'm going to be taking you through some of what has been going on in the last decade or so in terms of some of these questions. I'm starting out with this quote by the late Justice David Souter, who said, "The most significant problem is the inability of people to understand how government can and should function. It is a product of civic ignorance." Civic ignorance. So what could he mean? So here are some studies, the first one from the American Bar Association, which give us a sense of of exactly what he's talking about. So this is just a few years ago. The American Bar Association conducted a survey of civic literacy, so just asking kind of everyday Americans of their understanding, and found that 60% could not correctly identify the document that begins, "We the people." Right? Could not correctly identify the document that begins, "We the people." That is 60%. Right? Just let that sink in for a moment. At the 250th, that is concerning. Okay? When asked which rights apply only to U.S. citizens, 12% thought that due process of law was only for U.S. citizens. Okay? The Fifth Amendment refers to persons in general, not citizens in particular. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this is some of what Justice Sauer had in mind. What is the depth of the civic ignorance that many of our fellow Americans are struggling with? Next, when asked, what does separation of powers refer to? A full third were unsure, with some believing that while the judiciary, executive, and legislative branches are separate, the executive branch is superior to the other two. Right? So the whole idea of separation of powers, checks and balances, is unclear to many people. This is from a different study at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania from just last year. Nearly 1/3 of those surveyed were unable to name the three branches of government. Now, on the upside, about 70% were able to name them, so okay, I'm a little bit of a, kind of looking at the dark side here, but I still find 30% to be concerning as well. The three branches of government should be something that you can very quickly retrieve in your mind, and then also understanding the separation of powers, why we have it, what the idea is. The founders were actually very, very exacting about this, and were very concerned, and it's incredibly important to understand that. Just as an aside, a colleague of mine in political science, John Owen at the University of Virginia, he was explaining that in his classes, his students really literally did not understand separation of powers. They really didn't understand it. And so these are students at the University of Virginia. You would think that this is something that you could assume, but he is telling us from political science that this is not something that we can assume at this point. Next, almost 4 of 5 respondents identified freedom of speech as protected by the First Amendment, which is excellent, but the other 4 rights are not ready to mind. So again, Justice Sauer's concerns, along with many of us who are concerned. And so this is from an interview that Justice Sauer gave in 2012, so this is another part of what I started out with. And what he says here is something that comes through my mind often. He says, what I worry about is that when problems are not addressed, so problems in the society, people, losing their faith in government, cynicism spreading, people will not know who is responsible. And when the problems get bad enough, some one person will come forward and say, give me total power and I will solve this problem. That is how the Roman Republic fell. That is the way democracy dies. And if something is not done to improve the level of civic knowledge, that is what you should worry about at night. So, those studies give us a sense of what some of our challenges are in terms of freedom. And if you remember back to that quote from Jefferson, and Jefferson was saying, you cannot have ignorance and freedom at the same time. It's something that's never existed and it's not going to exist ever. I think as you think about some of those statistics, you can see why. If we are not sure what our rights are, if we're not sure what the law is, why we're set up the way we are, very easy for those freedoms to be taken away. But what about challenges to happiness? So here is where I'll bring you some of the social science data. I'm sorry that it's so depressing. I hate to be a purveyor of depressing facts. But deaths and despair are something that many researchers have been more and more concerned about. And so this gives you a sense of what has been happening in terms of deaths. Despair, we are not doing something right. And then when you ask people about happiness, it is the trends in unhappiness is always a very subjective thing, right? And you saw from my student responses that happiness can mean almost anything. But subjectively, that this is also something else where we don't find a lot of people who are feeling unhappy in various ways and on the upswing toward the end of this. And then when it comes to our teenagers. So this is the percent of female and male students who experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness from 2011 to 2021. Some of you may be familiar with Jonathan Haidt's research from psychology, and he thinks that around this time, as more teenagers were getting access to cell phones, and then later on to social media, there seems to be a correlation between that and some rising happiness. So where are we going wrong? Thinking back to some of those questions that I asked my students, freedom is the ability to do whatever with no restrictions. What does that get us for our students and for ourselves? Happiness is a lighthearted feeling that makes worries disappear even for a split second. So it's kind of papering over, perhaps, a pervasive unhappiness. And so the challenge then is, how do we find these ways to help our students come back to a larger and deeper, richer tradition of understanding freedom and understanding happiness that will stand them in good stead? Thank you. Absolutely. No, I think that they're connected. And so the founders obviously cared about the basics, of the government process, but virtue was very foundational. And so when I started out talking about happiness and 18th century notions of happiness that drew on the ancients, that is inseparable from the idea of virtue. And so this is one of the things when I'm speaking with my students in the 7 Great Questions class or the Freedom and Flourishing class, that they really have a hard time with. So we're reading Plato and Aristotle, and we're looking at this idea of virtue, and they're good troopers because this is not what they grew up. They didn't come to Brookfield, and so we're wading through all of these writers that, quite honestly, are very dense, and it's an extremely countercultural thing for them to imagine that virtue. You cannot be happy without virtue. And what it always goes back to is their understanding that happiness is relative. That each person defines their own sense of happiness, and that I cannot actually be wrong about what will make me happy. And so we get stuck on that. And I will push and I'll say, so if my idea of being happy is that I go out partying every night using various kinds of mind-altering substances, and come stumbling back home in the morning, and then, in terrible shape. But I keep doing this pattern, and I define that as my happiness. Am I happy? I said, well, if that makes you happy. And so trying to get them back to this understanding of virtue and moderation It takes some doing. But yes, the understanding of virtue and the moral formation that comes along with it is absolutely foundational to this older understanding of virtue. I find that by the time we've come through the medieval period, and we're reading Dante, we're reading Aquinas, they're starting to kind of turn the corner to see that, well, maybe it does matter, but it's very slow going. And so yes, I think the moral formation part of it, and this is also part of one of the books that I'm working on right now, which is the idea of the moral imagination. I think is also absolutely crucial. And so the moral imagination, the author, well, there are a couple of authors that I draw on. So one is Russell Kirk, who was foundational to the kind of intellectual foundation of American conservatism. And what he argues is that you have to fill the minds of young people with good things, so with good literature, with good history and historical exemplars. You can think of it as the furniture of the mind. What do I reach for when I'm in crisis, when I'm in trouble, when I'm hurting? It is those stories, that history, those exemplars that fill the moral imagination. And he, in turn, was building on Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was the first to kind of mention this idea of moral imagination. And then I also draw on the work of Iris Murdoch, who was a philosopher, and she was also a literary writer. And she describes the moral imagination. She says that human beings are the kinds of beings who make pictures of the world and then come to resemble those pictures. We make pictures of the world and come to resemble those pictures. And so, what are we filling our young people's minds with? Because they're going to come to resemble the pictures of what they're reading, right? And there's another author I like to draw on is Vegan Roy. He's got a book called Tending the Heart of Virtue, and it's all about fairy tales. And he was a professor at the University of Virginia, and he used to teach a very popular course on fairy tales. He's got this book that was just had its 25th anniversary reissue a couple of years ago, where he does a deep reading of fairy tales, but not just any fairy tales. What he shows is the major transformation in the way we tell those stories. So the Disney version versus, say, the Brothers Grimm version. Literally, the virtue is stripped out of most of the Disney versions. One of my favorite go-tos is Cinderella. So if you look at the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, and you look at the Disney version of Cinderella, very different virtues. So I won't go into everything, but that whole aspect of moral formation runs very, very deep. And if you go back to the era of the founders, there's an assumption that we're building on that more ancient and medieval understanding of freedom and happiness that is really just gone now for most people.
Angel, as a part-time professor, the struggle I always had with college students was to communicate quickly. I felt you had 20 seconds to get your message across, maybe 20 words. Tomorrow you're going to be speaking with high school students. Take that complex message that you just talked to us about. I love it. How do you give them a takeaway quickly that they can say, I get it?
Okay. Well, I will say that the message tomorrow is adapted to be a bit more interactive, asking some questions. I hope I might get a few responses to it. And so I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is asking them to have questions that then allow maybe a little bit of a surprise or kind of insight or a comparison of this is what I was thinking and this is now what I see. So a way to kind of give some pegs to hang these messages on, that is my initial thought of how I want to do that. And then I'm also hoping that they will identify somewhat with, or perhaps critically engage with, what my students have said about about what freedom and happiness are. So I'll be very curious, because when I've done a version of this talk with classically educated young people, in this case it was a high school audience at a classical education conference, and it was for the young people. And when I showed them some of those responses from my students, well, first of all, I asked them to give me their responses before I showed them what the UVA students did. And when they gave me their responses, they sounded much more like the ancients and the medievals. And so then when I showed them the UVA student responses, they were kind of shocked. But that's because they had a classical education. And so my hope is that we can get some, at least in parts of the talk, some kind of dialogue about this. And that's my hope. We will see how it goes. That's interesting. So it sounds like, in a sense, it's not even so much private property as you're talking about consumption of large amounts of property, of things. So is the question private property per se, or kind of what you're describing sounds like a kind of overconsumption? Is that part of what you're interested in? Yeah. I mean, on the idea of private property, obviously there have been very different kinds of societies with different property regimes. I think it's possible for people to be happy under different kinds of property regimes. But even there, like if I think about some societies that I know of that have more kind of communal property arrangements, there's something that's private to you, right? I can't think of any kind of society where there's nothing, nothing that you can call your own, because otherwise you are in a situation where you have no kind of self-determination, self-definition, if you've got nothing that you can reliably call your own. So I think there is a very kind of visceral sense of being able to have some kind of property you can call your own. And certainly coming out of the Black intellectual tradition, property in oneself was the first kind of property that had been established, and that was incredibly important to happiness. But on the second question, in terms of consumption, and how consumption or large amounts of consumption are related to happiness, I think that's a much cloudier situation. I think it's harder. I don't have the exact studies, but what I can tell you is that those who do more quantitative studies of happiness have found that after a certain tipping point, once you've got the basics covered in terms of food and shelter and a reasonable income to cover those, more money does not make you happier. And so I don't have the precise tipping point of what that is, but it's fairly low. And there isn't much correlation. And once you get over some of those basics and maybe a few luxuries, there's no indication that having more and more money or things makes you happy. But I would say that's not the assumption that I see in my college students. So when we're having these conversations about happiness and looking at various definitions of happiness, there is still very much persistent understanding that it's having lots of money and lots of things that will bring happiness. Do you want me to pick the?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for the work you do within the realm of character education in the lens of in the landscape of freedom. Could you
grade level?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think some combination makes sense to me. Some explicit, but probably most implicit. So I have two things in mind here. So one is, again, the work of Megan Royan on the moral imagination, tending the heart of virtue. Most of the writers that I know on the moral imagination really focus on story. So it's much more implicit. But here's the thing, is that we have to very carefully curate that content, right? There's a very big difference between the Disney fairy tales and Brothers Grimm fairy tales, or some of the older versions of those fairy tales. Because as I was saying, the older versions, they're often, much more tapped into religious faith, into older models of virtue. And so even though they're not explicit in that way, they are telling those stories that are in touch with the older tradition. Whereas the newer versions, I've seen many newer versions, are almost completely uprooted from that tradition and just have kind of really reinterpreted those stories, and they turn out to be a lot more about, kind of, you tell your own story. You do what you think is best. So part of it, a large part of it is implicit, but that rests on a very careful curation of the materials that we put before our students. On the other hand, I think that there are some ways to make it explicit as well, in a way that doesn't kill it. Because sometimes what happens, if you are too explicit and hammering away at it, then students just don't want to have anything to do with it. But one of the ways that I think it can be more explicit is in, especially at the lower level, in the lower school, is doing things like copy work. And so copy work is this old kind of pedagogy. It's just, when children are learning how to write, giving them certain lines to write and copy over and over again, or giving them passages to copy that reinforce certain virtues. So that are from literature, could be biblical literature, or could be other literature, where they are copying and they're getting the skill of writing, but it's about what they're writing. And so they're getting that message. And then the other way, I think, is one of the things I love, which is commonplace books. And commonplace books, where they're writing passages from readings, and they can choose what they want to write down. But the key thing is that they would then have to thematize those quotes. And thematize them, the themes could be things like faith, courage, love, that they are looking systematically through what they're reading and pulling out what are some of the main themes or virtues, and then using that to write papers or do reflections. So I think it's probably a combination, but mostly implicit.
We have one more question.
Jefferson was involved in sort of pushing for government involvement in education back in Virginia, wrote documents and such. Government hasn't worked out all that well historically in the public sector regarding education. And I'm wondering if there is something in your mind as a solution to that, without getting political. Just wondering if you see something that might be a better landscape for the United States, so that we can curate virtue and bring us back to where we need to be.
Yeah, so Jefferson did have a very strong vision of education that did involve the state. But of course, this is at a time before we had any kind of education system. So, if he were writing now, he might have very different things to say than he did in the 18th century. In the 18th century, what he was trying to do was to have a system where young boys, because it was boys at the time, where young boys, especially young boys who maybe weren't from the upper echelons of society, would get a chance to have an education. So he had what I would say at that point was a pretty forward-looking understanding that he wanted to have a situation where an everyday boy, you could say, would get a chance to have, like, you would find those who were really bright, and then you would bring them along and educate them, and eventually the best ones will go to William and Mary College, right? So in the 18th century vision, I think that made sense. You know, we want to kind of have something that goes along with this democratic project. We want to be able to educate widely and find the best and the brightest. Given where we are today, we're at a very different point in the 21st century. We've had a rather long go at public education. So I think I would say choice is a very important thing, right? I have kind of run the gamut. So I went to all public schools myself. I homeschooled my daughters for most of their education until one entered 7th and one entered 10th. And then my oldest graduated from a private classical Christian. The youngest is still at that private classical Christian. So I've kind of seen, you know, just about every part of it. And what I keep coming back to is to have a system where parents have the maximum amount of choice and support in the choices that they make. Otherwise, I think it becomes very difficult to support the kinds of initiatives that we want to see in terms of parents being able to get the best education for their children. And when you have an environment where it's very difficult, say, to start new charter schools or to start new private schools or to homeschool, when you have a legislative environment that makes that very difficult, I think that militates against the best kind of education. But I think that has to be balanced, I would say, with the least advantaged. And the reason I say that is because in New Orleans, post-Katrina, it went to an all-charter system. And I saw some very unfortunate situations where parents who were not mobilized, who didn't have a good education. I knew one teen mother, her daughter who never made it to kindergarten. She was delayed by a year or two because the mother just couldn't figure out the system. So I think we have to find a way to balance a choice, but to also make it so that the least advantaged will not be left out.
I want all children to be educated. I'm all participating, all children. I'm just wondering if it could be privatized somehow. That's all I know.
It would.
If it be privatized somehow.
No. There probably is a way, but I'm not a policymaker, so I would not want to venture how it could be done.
Go ahead, Larry.
So perhaps we do that before you as well. I was wondering how you approach sociologists, educational theorists, like guys like John Marsh, even when she was your professor, maybe Gladys Owens, I'm not sure she was, you were at Madison, but she was there.
Oh, yes, she was not one of my professors.
Or Jean Mangan. How do you integrate them into your thinking about the shortcomings in education?
So the scholarship that I do is not directly on education. So they're not usually the work that I do on education tends to be very classically oriented, and so I'm not usually pulling on those particular authors. The books that I write, as a scholar, so I have two kind of buckets. I have some of the mainstream work I do in sociology, and then I have the kind of work I do in the Black intellectual tradition, which is really in the classical space. And then the book Conversations on American Freedom is also kind of more classically oriented. So I just end up not really drawing on those authors. I should say I'm a fairly unusual sociologist. Most sociologists are not reading classic texts and integrating them into their writing. And so my push has been to kind of do the kind of work and to advocate for the kind of work in the discipline that would open up that vision for thinking about what is a good life and what is a good society based on some of these older conversations. And so that's the push that I try to make.
Is there another question? Well, let's thank Dr. Parham